Hi and welcome to another RPM Technik video. I'm Tim Harvey and with me today Greg Daly from RPM Technik, and we're going to talk about how GT3 developed from 991 to 992. And we've two beautiful examples here with us today, this Miami Blue 991 and the Shark Blue 992. Greg, visibly lots of differences, but in detail we can really get into it.
Yep, we're going to get into the facts and figures. We're going to have a look inside them, see how some of the tech changed between the two cars, but probably most interestingly for anyone watching it, you're going to drive them.
And most interestingly for me too. So Greg, starting with the 991, give us an overview of the model.
Well, the 991 series actually came out at the end of 2011-2012, and the GT3s were first introduced in 2013. This particular example of what the point of our video today is on the second generation of the car, and that was released in 2017. That had a list price of about 113,000. I defy anyone to
basic.
I was about to defy anyone to find one that was spec'd basic, but 113k as a list price. Porsche sold them in relatively small numbers. For this model group, they never actually gave any exact figures, but yeah, supply was limited by how many they could build, they said, rather than actual numbers.
Introduced in 2021, the GT3 model of the 992 was heralded by much expectation and critical acclaim.
Absolutely.
Give us an overview of the model.
So yeah, as you say, Porsche reintroduced the 911, which they called the 992 on this generation in 2019. A couple of years later, the GT3 arrived. So these had a list price originally of 136k, but no two of them are ever the same.
Too many options.
Indeed, and I don't think actually anyone ever supplied one at 136k anyway, but needless to say, that's what their list price was. Porsche don't limit the amount of cars that they produce, but they're limited by how long the production lines run for, so not a limited run car, and offered in both PDK and manual transmissions straight from the off.
Greg, let's put a bit of detail onto the 991 and start with the exterior.
Yeah, certainly. So with the 991 front end, we've got three large intakes here which are aiding the cooling of the vehicle. So clearly designed to run at high RPM for long periods of time, so that needs to be managed. And we've got the exit vent on the top here, which allows the radiators to cool. We've got the front end is actually a plastic front bumper, which has got an adjustable front splitter, which works in conjunction with the rear spoiler, which we'll come to in a moment. We've got aluminium bonnet, wings and roof. If we come down to the side of the car, the 991 generation run on a 20-inch wheel, so we've got a 9-inch front and a 12-inch rear, so you know, big amount of rubber keeping the car on the deck. And then if we look at the brakes, with all models they come in a choice of steels or ceramics. This car's got the steels, which is denoted by the red calipers, and if it had ceramics we'll obviously have a yellow caliper. So 380mm front disc, it's a big bit of metal which is helping the car stop. Something that Porsche are famed for is the strength of their brakes. If we then come down to the rear of the vehicle, we've obviously got a large rear spoiler, which, as I say, in adjustment in conjunction with the front splitter, has 3 adjustments. So that can be done via Allen keys underneath here. And at 125 miles per hour, the car creates about 70 kilos of downforce.
Which is about one of you or half of me.
Oh. Yeah. Should we try it? And it also has a rear diffuser which works in conjunction with the rear spoiler, so it has a flat underbody which manages the air as well.
Greg, the 992 visually a lot more aero on the car, but a lot of detail changes as well.
Yep, as you say, Tim, you can clearly see the car looks different, so we've got different rear end and front end, but crucially this was the first GT3 that ran a wide-bodied chassis. So what we mean by that is we've got a wider rear arch and a wider front arch, which allows us to put bigger alloys on the car, bigger tyres and a better contact patch. So we've got the first GT3 to ever run with what we call a staggered setup, so 21-inch on the rears and 20-inch front tyres. So we've gone up to a 9.5-inch wide front and still a 12 on the back, but physically more tyre on the floor. As you say, the rear spoiler, the aerodynamics of the car have changed too. So now we've got 125 miles an hour, 144 kilos of downforce, so me and you maybe. Yeah. And interestingly though, this aluminium spoiler bar is actually directly attached to the chassis, so therefore it's putting the downforce into the suspension and obviously actively working. As we come down the side of the 992, still run an option of steel and ceramics. A nice little small note, you could now also choose to have black calipers to confuse the non-Porsche files out there, which was just an option, but also the first GT3 to be offered with an option of a carbon fibre roof, which not only is light but also looks pretty cool. But also continued on from that, it's the first GT3, so non-RS, that uses more of what Porsche call CFRP, so carbon fibre reinforced plastic. So bonnet is made of that, as are the front wings. The front splitter and the rear spoiler now have 4 different adjustments for downforce. So there's some little plastic items underneath which, when the car's in the air, or you can if you fancy fiddling about on the floor, adjust those to adjust the front and the rear end downforce, and obviously you want to make sure that they're balanced. And the last thing is, on the front of the car, seemingly we have just one large intake, whereas before we had 3. But actually what Porsche have done is we've still got that intake, but they're just managing the airflow a little bit better on the front end. And then the snout has changed a little bit as well from the previous generation, where we've got these 2 exits for hot air that's coming off of the front radiators and managing it over the top of the car. Wasn't sure about these when they first came out, but my eyes have settled and I quite like them now. What do you think?
Yeah, I like them. Question I have for you though is, with increased use of carbon fibre and lightweight glass, how do the weights compare?
Depending on where you read, and it's hard to find a definitive weight of the car.
Because of specifications.
Exactly. Yeah. But if we took a PDK version of both cars, it's about 5 to 10 kilos difference. So while there's a perception that the 992 is a massive car, it's only a couple of centimetres here or there different, and as I say, 5 to 10 kilos in weight, which is really nothing.
No. So we've moved to the back of the car, Greg, to talk about engines and transmissions. Yes. How they differ between 991 and 992. Yep. On paper, quite similar engines.
Absolutely. Porsche still put them in the back. In the right place. So what we've actually got is the same engine. There are a few sort of very small detailed changes, but essentially we've got a 4-litre flat 6, which is a dry sump lubrication, which simply means that under extreme loads it can manage the oil transfer around the engine better. Naturally aspirated, obviously. Crucially.
Still with 9,000 rev limit on both.
Absolutely, which is again something we'll have a listen to later on. And interesting, both have independent throttle bodies, so it manages airflow and fuel into the engine better as well. So we've got 493 bhp to be precise, or 500 ps in European lingo, on the 991.2. And on the 992 we have 510 ps or 503 horsepower, and then I think about 7 pound-foot of torque improvement on these as well. So
although these are Porsche horses and they always feel more in the flesh than they're listed on paper.
Yes,
and about 10 horsepower more between them roughly.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you rightly say, sometimes we've run these on dynos and seen a bit healthier engines, but anyway, that's a different topic. So yep, naturally aspirated flat 6s in both of the cars. And actually, when Porsche did some testing on the 992, some of the interesting things they did was they ran this engine for 16 hours at Nardo at 300 kilometers an hour. So that was 4,800 kilometers in 16 hours to prove the reliability of these engines, which is like fantastic, really. Which is why I encourage everybody to use 9,000 revs in every gear all the time, because you're not going to wear it out when it's warm. Yeah, when it's warm. But Porsche introduced what they called some of the RSR technology into these engines. So I'm no engine builder, as you know, as anyone knows, but I'm told what that means is that the valve lifters are not hydraulic anymore, so don't need any adjustments over time, and obviously that's something that could fail at 9,000 RPM. So they're a solid lifter, so therefore can take a lot more higher RPM for sustained periods of time, and if it's obviously worked on the RSRs, it eventually comes
Let
down
me
to the road
simplify
car.
it for you. That engine in the 992 is almost identical to the Cup engine in all the Carrera Cups and Super Cups around the world. That is all you need to know.
It's pretty impressive,
Yeah.
to be perfectly honest, isn't it? And then both cars were offered with manual and PDK gearboxes. So with the PDK transmission, it's about, I think, 30 kilo weight difference to a manual, and that utilises what they call an E-diff for the limited slip differential in conjunction with Porsche torque vectoring, hope everyone's still awake, which individually brakes the rear wheels to help the car sort of slingshot through a corner. The manual retains an old-fashioned LSD plated diff, which you can upgrade or change if you wanted to. And then in terms of numbers, which is quite interesting actually, whilst a lot of people obviously very forthright for the manual box, the sales stats actually show it's 60% PDK to 40% manual. Again, each to their own. In terms of resale, there's not really much of a difference. It's whichever you'd prefer, but one's quicker than the other, obviously.
Well, PDK is fantastic on track, and obviously these cars are built primarily for track use, but a lot of people like the engagement of manual, and that split proves it.
Absolutely, yes. And again, transmissions almost identical between the two of them. Shift speeds are minutely improved on the 992, but I don't know if I've ever heard anyone get out of one of them and moan about gearboxes. So and very, very durable, both engine and transmission.
Greg, if we delve a little bit deeper underneath the surface into the mechanicals of the car, tell us about the suspension first.
Well, as you say, GT3s, it's all about what's underneath the stuff that we can't see. So 991.2 GT3 runs a normal McPherson setup on the suspension. So we have spring and damper with an adjustable setting for the firmness of the damper, which Porsche call PASM, or Porsche Active Suspension Management. So two settings on that. The car is also height adjustable, however that's manual, so it would have to go onto a ramp for that to be adjusted. We've also got adjustment on these for tow, we've also got adjustment for camber, and we've also got adjustable anti-roll bars, both front and rear, so that the car can be fine-tuned to your setup. The 991.2 GT3s also, like the first gen of the 991, run a rear wheel steer. So what that means is there's a very small adjustment, and there's some motors on the rear wheels which are adjusting them in and out, which from the driver's point of view makes the car feel more nimble on turning, doesn't it?
Basically, at slower corners it's more agile, it's using more rear steer.
Yep.
In the high speed you've still got stability without using it.
Exactly. So brakes wise, I've touched on them earlier. However, with this particular car, well, all Porsches actually, they are all made by Brembo. So we have a 6-piston front caliper and a 3-piston rear caliper. They are massive. If you compare the power the car runs and the weight compared to other manufacturers, Porsche's brakes are always way over-engineered, and there's no surprise why they hold lap records around many circuits, because they stop just as well as they go. Both of these run a centre lock wheel, and these on the steels are a 380mm disc, and if it was a ceramic one, it's a 410mm front disc. So yeah, huge.
And multi-link rear suspension.
Multi-link rear suspension, which works in conjunction with the rear wheel steer, and a mixture of rubber bushing and also rose joints, which give a nice combination of very, very precise inputs, but also it's a road car, so we don't want metal on metal and horrible noises that come with it.
Big talking point, of course, about 992 was the double wishbone suspension. We can't see it in this shot, but tell us about it, Greg.
Absolutely. So it's a big change for Porsche, and it's not something they've used on the road cars before. So in essence, what we've got is two control arms, one at the top of the shock and one at the bottom, which in very simple terms gives the car better control when it's under high load of the wheel itself. So therefore, Porsche are looking at where they can take lap times and ultimate performance of the car, and that was the first thing that they had to do. Still runs the PASM system, so we've got adjustable suspension in terms of softness and firmness. We've also got height adjustments still, and we've still got camber, toe and adjustable anti-roll bars. On the rear of the car, they did have to change a few items of the multi-link rear suspension to work in conjunction with this and the rear wheel steer. As we'll come to later when you drive it, that translates into a different sort of steering feel, doesn't it?
Definitely. It's basically to control the contact patch of the tyre and the road in extremis, if you like, in different situations. But it does have a different feel behind the wheel, and I'll talk about that when I drive it.
And then the last thing to mention is the brakes on the car. Still got a 6-piston Brembo front, 3-piston rear caliper, about 10mm front and rear, whether it was a steel or a ceramic brake, larger. So we've got a bigger contact patch for the brake pad to bite onto. They weren't lacking in the 991.2, and they're certainly not lacking here.
A very familiar interior to many of us in the 991, Greg.
Yeah.
Tell us how it was optioned.
As you rightly say, so to begin with, the basic architecture inside these cars has been the same since 2011. And if I was to summarise it in a positive way, it's more button-led. Everything's quickly accessed. You can choose, sat-nav controls, PDK gearbox, sports exhaust, etc. At a quick touch. So interior-wise, options that you could choose between was leather or plastic dashboards, comfort and club sport, so that meant roll cage, bucket seats, etc. And there was 2 types of bucket seats which you could choose on this particular derivative. 95% of your time you're probably sat here, and one thing that Porsche absolutely nail every single time is driving position.
Absolutely.
So driver sits lovely and low in the car, pedals, steering wheel, gear lever, all exactly where you would expect them to be. And for a car of its type, again, you're not compromised with vision. So you can see out the back of the thing easily, you can see around the car nice and straightforward. So one of the tech differences, so this car runs what Porsche call PCM4, Porsche Communication Management 4, which just simply means your sat nav and your phone module. It runs off of Apple CarPlay, so it'll take you anywhere in Europe, anywhere in the UK, super simple and straightforward and easy to use. And again, across the dashboard of the car, we've got more dials, so everything's a little bit more analog in this car. And it does feel a little bit smaller inside these ones, I think in a positive way. It's kind of nice and costing, I'm not sure if you agree on that, but and then use of materials, you've got, blimey, everything from Alcantara leather, deviating stitching. There's, the touch points of the car are lovely.
I'm an absolute sucker for carbon fibre and Alcantara. For me, that is race car. I love it.
Exactly. So yes, interior of the 991, as you say, a familiar place, but it works, and hence why they didn't change it for a decade.
Let's have a look at 992. Greg, close your eyes and you could be sitting in 991. The seating position, pedals to seat to steering wheel are all very familiar. As soon as you open your eyes, it's a very different environment.
It is a perfect driver position still. Yeah, I mean, as you say, if you were to summarise it in a word, it's probably futuristic. The interior sort of dashboard layout and certain other pieces have been borrowed from the Taycan, which is a beautifully built car, obviously lacking a certain engine, but there we go, we'll move on. Yeah, in terms of the dashboard, we've gone more digital now. Removed pretty much all of the actual analog dials and got a much larger satellite navigation screen in the middle of the car. So this one runs PCM 5, still retains the use of Apple CarPlay and integrates with your phone really well, along with some of the Porsche apps, which you can sort of play around with your car. But it's a car that you sit on the driveway a bit more to set up, isn't it?
Well, crucially, the one thing they have retained is an analog rev counter, which sits proudly straight in front of you, and a few key buttons.
Yeah, the sort of the quick access buttons, as you say, they're the essential ones that you really want. And again, one of the first that they introduced on this particular model was that with the axle lift, it's memorised to GPS position. Yeah. So press it once, it'll remember that you used it there, and next time you go there, you don't need to press the button again, it'll automatically lift. But yeah, as you say, having an analog rev counter that revs to, revs out to 10 as a max on there is a special car, isn't it? Not many do that.
Yeah, but don't go beyond 9.
No.
What about trim levels inside? Similar?
Yeah, even more options Porsche introduced in this in terms of personalisation,
yeah.
And that's something that Porsche have really sort of cottoned on to in the last 2 to 5 years, is that whilst it is the ultimate track car, people's desire to make it bespoke has gone even more,
yeah.
And they're happy to sort of indulge people in that. But yeah, essentially 2 trim levels, comfort and club sport, if we ignore the touring for a sec. So comfort and club sport, and essentially to look in the car quickly, the club sports have got the roll cage and the bucket seats, which they've just slightly changed the design of, and the comforts have the sports seats and no roll cages in the back.
No folding seat option in this one though?
No, I think they realised that on the previous gen the uptake on that seat was getting a bit lower, so I assume for production reasons they've retained just the single, what they call full bucket seat now. Yeah, which is height adjustable actually, which when you mention it to people they kind of go, yeah, great, but that's actually
very useful.
Yeah,
yes.
Very useful.
And an old-fashioned manual-looking gear lever, even for the PDK.
Yeah, it's a nice little touch, I guess, isn't it? Because whilst we were talking earlier that PDK to manual sales, it's actually slightly stronger for the PDK. But I think it was Preuninger and Walliser. One of them preferred using the
Preuninger.
Yeah,
he liked to change gear manually, just sequentially on the lever rather than with the paddles.
And then Walliser liked the paddles. So yeah, it's a nod to that. And again, the sort of fit and finish of the interiors in both cars, considering the stresses and strains and the car twists, obviously, how it goes through all that and still retains very little wear and tear on the inside of the car is pretty remarkable. Only one thing I notice on a lot of them is the wear on the seat bolster wears quite quickly after about 5k and then retains it. It doesn't get any worse after that, so sometimes people sort of look at it, but apart from that, yeah, brilliant inside.
Beautiful. So here we are, very familiar territory for me, of course. 991 GT3s. I've had several of these. Absolutely love them, if I'm honest. So forgive me sounding biased, but until 992 came along, and I'll talk about that obviously in a minute, for me this was the sweet spot in terms of analog feedback, modern performance, track and road usability. And this car is as good in all those areas as you'd want it to be. For me as a driver, it's all about the feedback I get, the connection I feel as a physical human being with a mechanical implement. And that comes from the feedback you get through the steering for the tyre contacting the road, how the car travels across the road in terms of damping and suspension, and also of course how the car responds when you press the throttle. I can feel every ripple in the road, not because this car is overtly stiff, it's actually really well damped. On the standard dampers, you've got the option with PASM of a stiffer setting for the track or normal setting for the road, but I've got that great feel through the steering. I can feel almost every revolution of the tyre on the road, but as I say, not in a harsh way, just in a really well connected way. I never get bored of that engine. What a fabulous engine that is. Just listen to that. Absolutely fantastic. The car doesn't feel big or cumbersome, it feels light and agile. Yes, it's bigger than previous generations, say 997, 996 obviously, but it never feels too big. It always feels, to me, like the right size, weight, power to be the ultimate driver's car. I'm looking forward to seeing what the 992 is going to offer me in addition to this. So here we are in the 992 GT3, a car I also know well, having driven several on track and on the road. And your initial impression as soon as you drive away is it's not that different to the 991. It's only when you delve a little bit deeper that you find out the real abilities of this car. The first thing you notice is that the car is just that little bit more modern. Everything is a little bit smoother, slightly less mechanical, so the gear change is smoother. It hasn't quite got that mechanical punch of in the 991. It's very smooth, every bit as quick if not quicker, but not quite so mechanical. The feel of the car is slightly smoother. If I can relate that to the feedback I'm getting, it's just a little bit more polished. Everything from how I feel the front tyres on the road, to the noises within the chassis, to the amount of bump that's sent through the chassis to the driver's seat. Everything is that bit more modern and that bit more polished and smooth. That isn't to say it isn't wonderful, but it's slightly less analogue than in the 991. And the same goes obviously for the interior. A completely modern, totally different interior to the 991. Light years ahead in a way, but thank goodness they retain that old analog rev counter, the only gauge you really need to look at anyway. So what's the engine like? Well, it feels very similar. You can't honestly say that you can feel 10 more horsepower in a car that basically weighs the same. What you do know though is that you've got the same Carrera Cup Super Cup engine in the back of your road car that they race with at the Monaco and Spa Grand Prix. That's quite a cool feeling. So apart from feeling on the road quite similar to the 991, apart from a more polished feel to it, where are the real abilities in the 992 GT3? Well, the fact is you can only explore those on the track. The increased aero, the slightly increased power, but moreover the bigger contact pack from the tyres and the wide body chassis just give it a lot more grip on the track. Staggered wheel sizes, 21 rear, 20 front, as opposed to 20s all round. It's all track focused. In fact, on track, this GT3 feels more like a 991 GT3 RS, and that's a measure of its abilities. This car was the most talked about, hyped up, eagerly expected car of 2021. And it really didn't disappoint. It's moved the standard GT3 on to a really whole different plane. And that's in terms of track performance. Some would say it's too track focused. I disagree. I still think it's a wonderful road car. But the fact that that GT3s are meant to be used on track as well, and you have that increased performance from this car, for me makes it a no-brainer. It's a quantum step up from 991. Remarkable, and a lot of fun.
Right, Tim, we've looked at all the facts, all the figures, all the geeky anecdotes that people will obviously bring out at the dinner party. And more importantly, you've driven them back to back. So let's hear your appraisal.
Two magnificent cars. Taken in isolation, as we always say, it feels hard to improve on a 911, but the evolution always does. And the 991 is a brilliant all-round car, sold in huge numbers, satisfies both road drivers, track drivers, and a combination of the two.
Yeah.
But you can see where the money's gone in the evolution of 992. It's a more polished all-round car. I believe it's a more modern car on the road, both in terms of your interior, in terms of smoothness, of mechanical noise and feel, but on the track is where it really shines, where those bigger wheel sizes, more aero really shine forth. And on track, this is more like an RS version of a 991, it really is. So that's where the development's gone, and again, a brilliant car.
No, it's all valid points, and appreciate it. It's interesting to hear from someone with very good driving experience background to give those points. So appreciate it.
Not at all. We've enjoyed making the video. We hope you've enjoyed it too, and we look forward to reading your comments.